What if the truth is this? She never really lets you go. She just waits to see if you'll come back when the next supply fails. When a narcissistic woman appears to move on quickly after a relationship ends, it often creates the painful impression that you were easily replaced. From the outside, it may seem as though she has found someone new and completely erased you from her life. But psychologically, what you are witnessing is not genuine emotional replacement. It is the illusion of replacement. A narcissistic personality is not driven by love in the way most people understand it. Instead, it is driven by the constant need for validation, admiration, and emotional fuel. The person who provides that fuel becomes what psychologists call a supply. When one source of supply begins to weaken, perhaps because you started setting boundaries, questioning behaviors, or simply became less available, the narcissistic mind instinctively looks elsewhere. The new person who enters her life may appear to take your place overnight. Photos are posted, attention shifts, a new story begins. But this rapid transition does not mean the previous emotional dynamic has truly ended. In many cases, it simply means the stage has changed and a new actor has stepped into the spotlight. Carl Jung once suggested that what we fail to confront within ourselves tends to repeat in our relationships. In narcissistic dynamics, this repetition becomes almost mechanical. The new supply is not chosen because they are uniquely understood or deeply loved. They are chosen because they serve the same psychological function you once served: admiration, attention, and reinforcement of the narcissist's self-image. And this is why many people later discover that they were never truly released. Instead, they were placed on what could be called an emotional waiting shelf. The narcissistic mind often keeps former partners within psychological reach, watching from a distance, occasionally resurfacing or leaving subtle emotional doors open. This realization can be both unsettling and liberating. Unsettling because it reveals that the relationship was less about connection and more about function. Liberating because it helps you understand that being replaced was never a reflection of your worth. The truth is simple, though difficult to accept. In the narcissistic world, people are rarely replaced, only rotated. And once you see that pattern clearly, the real question is no longer why they moved on so quickly, but why you would ever remain available for the cycle to begin again. One of the most confusing experiences people report after leaving a narcissistic relationship is the strange feeling that the connection was never truly finished. Even after a new person appears in her life, there may still be small signals, subtle contacts, or quiet reminders that you are not completely out of the picture. This is not accidental. It reflects what we might call the narcissistic backup strategy. A narcissistic personality rarely thinks about relationships in terms of emotional closure. Instead, relationships are unconsciously evaluated in terms of usefulness. If someone has once provided admiration, attention, loyalty, or emotional energy, that person becomes a resource in the narcissistic mind. And resources, in that psychological framework, are rarely discarded if they might still serve a purpose in the future. So even when a new supply enters the scene, the previous partner may still exist somewhere in the background. Perhaps she views your social media from time to time. Perhaps she sends a casual message. Months later, that appears harmless on the surface. Sometimes it comes in the form of curiosity, nostalgia, or a simple check-in that seems friendly and innocent. But psychologically, these gestures often serve a deeper function. They keep the door slightly open. Carl Jung spoke often about unconscious patterns that guide human behavior beneath our awareness. In narcissistic dynamics, this pattern is closely tied to insecurity. The narcissistic ego depends heavily on external validation. Because of this dependency, relying on a single source of admiration feels risky. Maintaining multiple potential sources, past, present, and future, creates a kind of emotional safety net. This is why many people feel as though they are being kept on standby. You are not fully engaged, but you are not fully released either. Your presence remains a possibility, a backup plan, should the current relationship fail to provide the same level of attention or admiration. Understanding this dynamic changes how you interpret those small moments of contact. What once felt like lingering affection may actually be a quiet attempt to preserve access. And the moment you recognize that pattern, a deeper realization begins to form. The only way to step out of someone's backup plan is to remove yourself from the game entirely. One of the most frustrating aspects of dealing with a narcissistic personality is the absence of true closure. In ordinary relationships, even painful endings eventually reach a point of finality. Two people acknowledge what has happened, emotions settle, and both individuals move forward with a clearer understanding of where things stand. But within narcissistic dynamics, closure often feels strangely out of reach. This is because closure requires something a narcissistic personality struggles deeply with: surrendering control. When a relationship ends, the narcissistic mind does not simply process the loss in the way most people do. Instead, it focuses on maintaining psychological influence. As long as some form of emotional connection remains, whether through confusion, unfinished conversations, or lingering hope, the sense of control is preserved. This is why the ending of such relationships can feel so ambiguous. You may receive mixed signals that seem to contradict one another. One moment there is distance, silence, and apparent indifference. The next moment there might be a message, a memory brought up unexpectedly, or a gesture that briefly revives the emotional connection. These moments create a kind of psychological fog, making it difficult to determine whether the relationship has truly ended. Carl Jung often emphasized that human beings are deeply influenced by unconscious motives, many of which revolve around power, identity, and ego. For narcissistic personality, the ego depends heavily on the reactions of others. When someone completely detaches, emotionally and psychologically, it removes that source of reflection. In other words, the mirror disappears, and for someone whose identity relies on constant validation, that loss of reflection feels threatening. So instead of offering a clear ending, the narcissistic dynamic tends to leave fragments behind. Unanswered questions, emotional hooks, or unfinished conversations that keep the other person mentally engaged. These fragments function like invisible threads, maintaining a subtle connection even after the relationship appears to be over. But once you recognize this pattern, something important becomes clear. Waiting for closure from someone who depends on control is often a losing strategy. Real closure does not come from their words, their explanations, or their timing. Real closure begins the moment you decide that your peace no longer requires their permission. Even after a narcissistic woman appears to have moved on, many people are surprised to discover that the story does not always end there. Months may pass, sometimes even years, and then suddenly she reappears. A message arrives out of nowhere. A memory is mentioned. Perhaps there is an apology or a warm reflection about the past that seems sincere and thoughtful. For someone who once cared deeply, this moment can feel confusing, even hopeful.
But in many narcissistic dynamics, this return is part of a pattern often described as hoovering.
The name comes from the idea of being pulled back in, much like a vacuum drawing something toward it. Psychologically, it reflects the narcissist's attempt to re-establish access to a former source of validation. To understand why this happens, we have to consider something fundamental about narcissistic psychology. The narcissistic ego is rarely stable on its own. It depends heavily on external responses, admiration, attention, emotional reactions, to maintain its sense of importance. When a new relationship begins, it often starts with intensity and excitement. The new person provides fresh admiration and enthusiasm, which temporarily strengthens the narcissistic self-image. But over time, reality enters the relationship. Expectations change. The novelty fades. The new supply may begin to question behaviors or set boundaries just as previous partners eventually did. And when that steady stream of admiration begins to weaken, the narcissistic mind instinctively looks backward. This is where the past becomes useful again. Former partners represent familiar sources of emotional energy. Reaching out can test whether that source is still available. Sometimes the approach is subtle, a simple greeting or a casual question. Other times it may appear more dramatic, involving regret, nostalgia, or promises of change. Carl Jung often spoke about the unconscious tendency to repeat unresolved patterns. In narcissistic relationships, this repetition can become a cycle that draws people back into the same emotional dynamic again and again and again. But recognizing the pattern changes everything. When you understand that the return is not necessarily about love, but about restoring attention and control, you gain a new kind of clarity. And that clarity leads to a powerful realization. The moment you refuse to respond to the pull of the past is the moment the cycle finally loses its power over you. Another layer of this dynamic becomes visible when we begin to look at how carefully a narcissistic personality manages appearances. On the surface, everything may seem perfectly clear. Once a new relationship begins, the message to the outside world is often simple. The past is over and a new chapter has begun. Photos appear, stories are told, and the narrative suggests confidence, happiness, and certainty. But what we see publicly is often only part of the psychological picture. For a narcissistic personality, maintaining a carefully crafted image is extremely important. The external story must support the identity they wish others to believe: admired, desired, successful in love, and always moving forward. Acknowledging lingering attachments or emotional contradictions would disrupt that image. So outwardly, the previous relationship may appear completely erased. Yet internally, the situation can be far more complex. The narcissistic ego depends on continuous reinforcement, and one source of validation is rarely enough to feel secure. This is why multiple emotional channels are often maintained at the same time. Current partners, former partners, potential admirers, and observers who still offer attention from a distance. Each of these sources contributes to maintaining the image of being valued and desired. Carl Jung often spoke about the concept of the persona, the masked individuals present to the world in order to shape how they are perceived. For most people, the persona is simply part of social life. But within narcissistic dynamics, the persona can become almost a performance. The relationship that the world sees must look impressive, stable, and enviable. It must reinforce the story that the narcissist tells about themselves. Meanwhile, anyone who once played a role in that story may still exist quietly in the background. Not publicly acknowledged, not openly connected, but not completely forgotten either. Their presence remains useful because it represents another mirror reflecting admiration back toward the narcissistic self. When you beg in to understand this structure, something important becomes clear. The relationship you thought you were part of may have been less about two people building something real and more about supporting a carefully maintained image. And once you see that difference clearly, you begin to understand a deeper truth. Your life was never meant to be a supporting role in someone else's performance. After examining these patterns, the illusion of replacement, the quiet backup strategy, the absence of closure, the cycle of returning, and the careful management of appearances, one final realization begins to emerge. Many people ask the same question: will a narcissistic woman ever truly let you go once she finds someone new? But when we look closely at the psychology involved, we begin to see that the question itself may be pointing in the wrong direction. Because in most narcissistic dynamics, true release rarely comes from the narcissist. Their entire relational structure is built around maintaining access to sources of validation. If admiration, attention, or emotional reaction can still be drawn from someone, the psychological door often remains slightly open. Sometimes this door stays open through memory, sometimes through occasional contact, and sometimes simply through the hope that one day the connection might revive itself. This is why many people find themselves mentally trapped long after the relationship appears to have ended. They are waiting, often unconsciously, for the narcissistic partner to provide the final word, the clear explanation, or the definitive ending that signals emotional freedom. But waiting for that moment can quietly extend the influence of the relationship far beyond its actual life. Carl Jung often spoke about the process of individuation, the journey of becoming psychologically whole and self-directed. A key part of that journey involves recall, aiming the authority over one's own inner world. Instead of waiting for others to define our emotional reality, we begin to define it our emotional reality. We begin to define it our emotional reality. In the context of a narcissistic relationship, this shift is transformative. It means recognizing that freedom does not arrive when the narcissist loses interest or moves on to someone else. Freedom arrives when you withdraw your attention, your emotional investment, and your need for their validation. That decision can take courage because it requires stepping out of a familiar psychological pattern. But it is also the moment when something powerful happens. The dynamic that once revolved around their control begins to dissolve. And perhaps the most important realization of all is this: someone who truly values you will never need to keep you within reach as a backup plan. The moment you stop waiting to be released is the moment you finally become free.